Here we go with chapter 10. This is the miscellaneous first moves for black chapter. How are you doing, Jesse?
I'm doing well. I'm excited to look at this chapter, and I have something to admit to you, Matt. I have not studied this one. So I studied the first nine, not so much chapter 10. So I'm going to be learning it along with the viewers. So after e4, we're covering many moves: d6, g6, knight f6, knight c6, and b6. So lots of options here for black to do something weird. Let's start with d6. This is known as the Pirc. It says that this was your main weapon in high school. Interesting. Um, it's an interesting opening. What are we recommending against it?
Yeah, so this is an opening that's a hyper modern system. Black wants to come at our center with their pieces instead of directly with the pawns, like you see in, you know, any of the other earlier chapters, essentially. So we're going to recommend d4. And after knight to f6, the main move, I'm going with the most common reply still, knight to c3. Now, at this point, we're going to look at e5 and g6. Most players are going to stick with their regular Peart's move order and play g6. And at this point, we're recommending bishop to e3. What I like about this system, and it's what I didn't like about it from the black side, is we're setting up queen to d2 and bishop to h6 ideas. And this can be a really lethal combination, especially if your opponent is unprepared. So at this point, we're going to look at two options, bishop g4, bishop g7 or knight to g4. Let's start with the most straightforward, bishop to g7.
Yep, and as Matt just said, we're going to line up our queen and bishop on this battery. You see this every so often, like in some Sicilian dragons or some like King's Indian defenses. So hopefully this isn't brand new to you, but we basically want to trade off this really nice bishop for black castles. No need to rush it, so we can castle. Um, and next we'll look at c6, and here I'm seeing f3 as a recommendation. So I'm getting some Scotch vibes here, a little bit. Looking for this type of pawn storm.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And so c6 is played because black wants to get their own pawn storm going. They need to come at our king because they know we're coming very quickly at their king side. So now we have e4 protected. We're preparing g4. So let's give black their pawn storm, b5. And at this point, b4 is not a threat because the f3 pawn defends the e pawn. So this knight on c3 is free to move. Keep that in mind. Now we can just play h4, start the attack, and we're attacking very quickly here. If it was our move, we could even play an immediate h5, followed by retreating this knight and playing g4, bishop h6. You can sometimes sacrifice that h pawn if you know that you can get your bishop to h6 and dislodge that black knight that's going to be on h5.
It's a good one to keep in mind. A lot of times you just want to like sack your knight or your rook for the knight, but not quite working here. So we have another tactical way to kind of attack the king. So after h5, womp womp, shutting down our h5 push. Let's play knight ce2 anyway, and really line up on the king side. Just kind of shifting all of our pieces over this way. I like this.
Yeah, this is the counter womp attack. So after knight b to d7, we just go immediately with g4. Okay, so this is a pawn sacrifice, but we're getting the big attack. H takes g4, knight to g3, and now we have h5 coming up next, and black is going to be in some trouble tactically. So let's go down this line just a little bit deeper. G takes f3, and at this point we play pawn to h5, and this h-pawn is actually ready to come to h6 next. And this can go wrong for black very quickly. All right, so I'm going to give black a mistake. It's a common move here. e5. How do we punish this?
Let's just keep chugging forward. H6. This bishop is basically trapped. It has one move and it has to go to a very sad square. Bishop H8.
Ooh,
And we are not done with this H pawn, my friends. H7 check. This is wild. Knight takes H7. And what's the follow up here? Looks like we just dropped our beautiful H pawn.
I want to put the queen on h2 and go for this little queen rook battery coming right up the h file. There's only one move that appears to keep black alive, knight d to f6, because if the other knight moved, we had queen takes h8 with a checkmate. But now we can play d takes e5, attacking the knight, and this d pawn is pinned because our rook is lined up with the black queen. This is already a +9 stockfish advantage because the attack is just way, way, way too strong. Black is going to be dropping material very shortly. So first line of the chapter, Black castled right into our Kingside pawn storm and got completely crushed over there.
I don't even know how black can avoid checkmate here. If we're taking this knight, it's just over. I'm
I
gonna
think
have to just
that's
like,
yeah, it's almost inevitable. I mean, that's the +9 eval. Like I bet if I let a +9 eval run, Stockfish will eventually say like mate in 61 moves or something with best
yeah,
play. Like it's got to be over at +9.
yeah.
All right, so now let's go back to move 4 and we will look at instead of bishop to g7, knight to g4. This is a good one to look at because there are other move orders where you can play f3 first or h3 first prior to putting the bishop here. So we have to consider what if black attacks that bishop immediately. And our recommendation is bishop to g5. And what we're going to argue here is that the bishop on g5, after taking two moves, 1, 2, is better than the knight on g4, which took two moves to get there.
Yeah, the knight on g4 seems like a bit of a target, and we don't want to give them our nice dark square bishop for free. So knight g5 looks strong. And after h6, we're going to retreat our bishop again. Bishop h4. We're not really willing to part ways with our bishop yet. Black is going to likely fianchetto. And here we are going to develop with a threat tempo on the knight since it is only defended one time. Where's the knight gonna go? Probably
Back to
f6.
f6. And if you count the pieces developed here, we have 3 developed to black's 2. And one of the reasons I really wanted to show this knight to g4 and h6 combination for black is to show what can happen in a line where our bishop goes on this other diagonal. Instead of being on the diagonal that hits h6, we can play for f4 and e5, which is a really strong idea. And we're also going to go knight f3 and kingside castle. So let's take this line just a couple moves deeper. Castle, knight to f3, and at this point, we're out of the Lee chess book. But let's look at one sensible move, knight to c6. Now we castle. Eval is 1.9 due to the extra space we have and the activity of our pieces. And what's our plan here in the next few moves?
Yeah, so we need to tuck the king away. It's a little exposed on this dark square diagonal. So let's maybe start with king h1, and then we're going some more pawn moves. We want to do h3, maybe e5, and just play with a lot of space and a good position, and just try to limit black's threats here and let our space kind of suffocate black.
Yeah, and the reason we have time for these moves, king h1, pawn to h3, is because if you look at our big center, how does black fight back against the center, right? Usually in this type of structure, they would want e5 or c5. Neither of those are very easy to play. And if black plays d5, then we kind of have options here, right? Like maybe we could snag the knight on f6 and win the d pawn. Or maybe it's a scenario where black gets d5 and we just play e5, and that's where we wanted our e pawn anyways. So, really nice attacking position without a lot of quick counter threats from black. That buys us the time to play these prophylactic moves. And that's something to keep in mind. Like a lot of players naturally don't want to play a slow move, right? Because we're always taught, like, oh, just go for the blow as soon as it's available because you don't want to miss your chance. Well, in this case, we can actually slow down a little bit, improve the position, and then go for e5. And plus 1.9, we're going to be in good shape here. Now let's back up to move 3, and we will look at e5 instead of g6. It's a bit odd looking. It's actually a very common move. Black is trying to tempt us with the queen trade, and I strongly considered recommending d takes e5. But in the end, I went with knight to f3 because I think it's just a little too close to equal with the queen trade. And there's also the um, fact that black is probably really well prepared for the queen trade if they do this exact setup, right? So it's not going to be a position where we're more comfortable than them. They played an offline. and got us into their comfort zone. So let's avoid that and just play knight f3.
Yeah, I like that move. One aim in all of our courses is to have the ball a little more in our court than our opponents. So we often play like third or fourth top moves that are a bit more tricky. And here's an example of that. So we can't go for the easy advantage, but too boring.
Yeah, and it's
uh,
a slight advantage. I think knight f3 is maybe even better chances to play for an advantage too in practical play.
yeah. Um, so after knight bd7, bishop c4, really nice diagonal for the bishop. Bishop e7, and we can castle. Anything to say about those last few moves, Matt?
I don't think so. Everything's feeling pretty natural. At this point, black is probably going to look to play either a6 or c6, take our bishop. When we see one of these moves played, we can play a4, which we've seen in previous chapters. I think in the last chapter we saw this. So let's give black castling first. We're going to put our rook on e1. So slowly improving the position. And if there's an eventual e takes d4 played, our e4 pawn really benefits from having this extra protection with the rook on e1. So again, this is kind of just like a waiting move, but it's a useful move, right? We improve the rook, guard the center. We're getting ready for black to take us. So now let's look at c6. That's the most common move for black.
Yep. So as Matt just alluded to, they really want to play b5 here. So let's take a move to prevent that with a4. And after b6, we have a fancy looking move here. Bishop a2. What's the deal with this move, Matt?
We don't want that bishop to become a target. So it's a kind of the same theme. It's just another little quiet move. Keep that bishop on the strong diagonal, and we will look to break in the center in a few moves. So let's give black on to a6, actually, is the most common move. And what they're trying to do here is slowly get their queen side developed. So at this point, we can play bishop to e3. We're also slowly improving our position. And here we have a zero.7 stockfish eval. We do have the extra space. We have mobility. And our plan here is to play h3 and pawn to b4. And what we're trying to do is attack in the center and on the king side while also controlling the queen side. So it's another one of those positions where we're really playing for full control. That's the main idea. And if you look at black's structure, it's very difficult for black to find a good pawn break to counter this control that we have. I really enjoy these positions. I actually had one very similar to this in a recent OTB event. And a lot of it's just keep calculating the pawn moves, right? Which pawn break will black go for? Will they play e takes d? Which pawn break will benefit white? Do you want to play d5 at some point, especially after b4? A lot of times that could be a good idea as well. Or maybe you want to take on e5 if you feel like you got quick play down the d file. So very rich strategic positions, not dry at all, and every single piece is on the board. That's really cool when you're 10 moves deep.
Yeah, and queen's on board.
Yes, and queens are on
No,
the board too.